You know, for us, whenever you are under a lot of stress or something happens in a bad way, a lot of us go back to that spiritual base. And as indigenous people, that's what we did. We wanted to pray. We wanted to go and appeal to our Creator, to our God. And it was really difficult for us to do. And as Two-Spirit people, that was even something that, you know, if the Creator told us this is who we were, then we wanted to be able to have that conversation. But with colonization, you know, and the intellectual piece, a lot of our children started being brought from the from the reservation areas into the boarding schools. And they had a three-prong approach when they brought the Native children to the boarding schools. One was education, civilization, and Christianization. And so some of the teachings at that time were, you know, if you go back to what they called the blanket, that you were not going to progress, you were not going to live well in this new land. And so they said, you know, if you go back to your spiritual beliefs, because we were told that they were of the devil. And there was one way to go, and it was just this particular way. And that, you know, we could not, you know, practice our old ways. And our old ways basically told us who we were within our communities. You know, how we related with each other. You know, how did, you know, the different animals relate? How did we relate to them? How did we relate to our grandparents? You know, to our husbands and our wives, to our children. All this stuff we were no longer being able to pass down for a number of reasons. One of them being that, you know, when we went to these schools, we were not allowed to speak our own language. And within our languages were our actual, you know, lessons. I believe it's in one of the languages of the Iroquois that when you say, when you define personhood, it's defined beyond just us as two-leggeds. That everything has a personhood. That the animals have a personhood. That the rivers have a personhood. That the trees have a personhood. That the rocks have a personhood. So when you talk about, you know, having equal rights, or you know, who should have, you know, the ability to be here or be there, and that everybody should be equal. When you say in English, it only pertains to those two-leggeds, and it doesn't talk about, you know, whether or not, you know, the spotted owl has a right to be where they're at, or the salmon or the whale or whatever it is, you know. But within the indigenous tongues, when you talked about that, you included all these entities. And that's kind of what was lost when our children went to boarding schools and they had learned English, because they didn't understand that anymore. And when they went home and their old people tried to talk to them and tried to relay their stories about, you know, who they were, what they were supposed to do, they didn't understand them. And if they did ceremonies, then they were told, ooh, these ceremonies are, you know, Father so-and-so said these are of the devil, and if I do these, I'm going to burn. And, you know, they gave us a pretty good description of what hell was, and I don't think I want to go there, you know. And so it was one of those things that was really, you know, just basically forced into these little children's brains. These people who are developing their brains hear these stories and are raised in, you know, as a social worker, I kind of think to myself, gosh, what happened to our community, you know? And when I look back at what, you know, this boarding school experiment that basically said, we're going to be able to, you know, make sure that they could speak English, and, you know, that they're good blacksmiths, and, you know, they know how to roll dough and all this stuff. And, you know, it took away a lot of our parenting abilities, our abilities to be able to understand who we are. And, you know, I think that people don't realize until now how important your ethnic identity is to your identity formation, you know. And so when that intellectual intrusion came in and we weren't able to pass our intellectual property down to, our young people, to be able to tell them who they were, how to live in this world, how to parent, all these things, it caused a big disruption. And whether or not we had Two-Spirit people within our communities. And part of it had to do with the fact that there's a story that's relayed about the conquistadores coming through the Southwest, and they had a big taboo about homosexuality. And so when they would find these Two-Spirit people, they would set their dogs upon them. And they knew that, they could call these Two-Spirit people out because they would see them being honored, during different times. And people were thinking that they were going to honor their Two-Spirit people. And what they had done is they had taken them to the edge of the village, and they had set they had war dogs back then, because whenever people would go to war, they would bring with them these big dogs that would go out onto the battlefield and would, attack their enemies. And so they had set these dogs upon, these Two-Spirit people. Well, even though we didn't have, email or cell phones or anything like that, this message started being conveyed to the other people, the other villages, and they would run with these stories, and they would say, do you know what happened back at, this place back here? These people are coming and they're killing, our Two-Spirit people. And so they started hiding them. And as they started hiding them, that same thing kind of happened after the boarding school era, when the old people would hear the young people coming back from the boarding school saying things like, this is not right, this is not of God, and this is wrong, and they say that if we do this, we're going to go to hell. And, a lot of the Two-Spirit people didn't want to share who they were, or the old people didn't want to share with these young people who didn't understand anymore. There was a time on a lot of our reservations where there was hardly any ceremonies being done for a number of reasons, and one of them being it was against the law. If you were caught with any ceremonial item, you could be thrown in prison. And it wasn't until 1978, the American Indian Religious Freedom Act came out then, that allowed us once again to be able to do our sundances, to do our potlatches, to do our naming ceremonies without the threat of being thrown into jail or thrown into prison or having our spiritual implements taken away. And so it was around that same time that this idea of who we were as Two-Spirit people started coming back out. Hey, yo, yo, yo.